Both.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, class. I'm William Mulvoy. I'll be joined with Sun and Kristin to present an article in BBC News entitled STIs, Why is Syphilis on the Rise? Here's a quick outline. We'll go to the next slide. Yep, article introduction. It's from June 10th, 2018. It is talking about syphilis and the background of syphilis and a recent uptrend in syphilitic infections in the UK. Going to be talking about some statistics, what the chemsex trend is in the UK, how more testing for syphilis, gonorrhea, and HIV has come out of this increase in syphilitic infections, the new age of education and STIs, cause and effects, theories, and finally a letter to the editor. Some background information about this article. Back in the 80s, syphilis actually was eradicated in the UK. Unfortunately, in 1999, they saw a significant reemergence of what they thought was a previously treated infection coming back with a vengeance. It was a relatively uncommon STI at that point. The number of cases increased from about 2,000 to about 7,000 cases, so a pretty significant increase in the incidence at that time. The populations affected the most were men who have sex with men, bisexuals, and unfortunately homosexuals overall. There's a new chemsex trend in the UK, and again, we'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's kind of an interesting aspect to one of the reasons why there's been an increase in syphilis in the UK. I'm also going to talk about how there's some contractions via oral sex and how that type of sexual activity has not really been trended that well, but it is something that's uptrending as well. How this outbreak has actually caused more people to seek screening and testing. However, there's also been significant budget cuts in the UK about STI treatments. Syphilis is an STI that can cause serious health problems if not treated. It's divided into stages: primary, secondary, tertiary, and latent syphilis. It's spread by direct contact with syphilitic sores during vaginal, anal, or oral sex. Syphilis can spread from an infected mother to an unborn baby. Primary syphilis is usually sores at the site of the origin of infection, and it's a firm, round, and palate sore. As you can see in the picture in the bottom right corner, it's an example of it. Secondary syphilis includes skin rashes, swollen lymph nodes, fever. Symptoms may be mild and or missed overall. Tertiary syphilis is associated with severe medical problems. The only way to really reduce your risk is to not have sex with a person or unprotected sex with persons, or, again, focusing on condom use. And finally, neurosyphilis and ocular syphilis have been reported from this disease, which significantly affects the central nervous system. Treatment is antibiotics, but damage done prior to the treatment can generally be irreversible. So overall, it tells you what syphilis is, how it's spread, what it looks like, how I reduce my risk of getting it, how does syphilis affect the pregnant mother, signs and symptoms, and can it be cured? Here we look at a slide, looks at a trend in the United States. You can see back in the 40s how it was pretty prominent and pretty prevalent in the general population, upwards of about 400 per 100,000 people in the population. And then with the introduction of penicillin, it dropped off significantly. Again, this is primary, secondary, and even latent syphilis. However, you see, even in the United States, there's been a slight uptick after 2011. And finally, the next slide looks at syphilis itself, but at a specific population. You can see the difference in men who have sex with men versus men who have sex with women. And the number is drastically different. So this is, unfortunately, a disease or an infection that affects homosexuals, gays, bisexuals, more so than heterosexuals. Statistically speaking, syphilis is still relatively uncommon. Only about 2% of the STIs diagnosed in England in 2017 were syphilitic. The fact that we're dealing with over a small number of cases makes the percentage increase look dramatic. There's been 1,000 extra cases in 2017, which equaled a 20% rise. The same number of extra cases of chlamydia would represent less than 1% rise. But nevertheless, there have been a steady rise in the number of diagnosed cases, more than doubling in a decade. So like I said, about 7,000, up from about 2,000 in 2008. The increase in syphilis almost all among the gay, bisexual, and other men who have sex with men population. According to the government agency Public Health in England, accounting for 78% of all cases diagnosed last year. The Public Health in England said it plans to increase the number of and frequency of testing in the population of high-risk patients in the population to promote early detection and treatment. And the chemsex trend, I'll turn this over to Kristin at this point.
All right, so what is this chemsex trend? Well, there's a couple factors, but Dr. French, who works for the British Association for Sexual Health and HIV, he's a spokesman there, says that the increase in STIs are linked to these changes in sexual behavior in a population. So Will already mentioned that there's an increased rise of prevalence and incidence of syphilis in men who have sex with men. Recent advances in technology like dating apps such as Tinder or Grindr basically increase access for people to have casual sexual relationships. And along with that, there's a link to drug usage. So chemsex is basically the trend where people start taking drugs, injectable drugs such as crystal meth, which inhibits their ability and impairs their judgment, and also leads to riskier sex behaviors like decreased condom use. And along with syphilis, Will already mentioned that chlamydia is by far the most common STI, but that has fallen among the population in general. And although it has fallen in the general population, it's continued to rise in men who have sex with men, along with syphilis and gonorrhea, which is another STI. And so gonorrhea in specific has risen in the population as a whole, but more than a fifth of those cases were diagnosed in 2017 than the year before. And so this next slide is a chart. It's a graph showing the trends in primary and secondary syphilis infections. In general, in Europe, there's less surveillance available for monitoring STIs compared to the US. So this graph is a little bit old, but nevertheless, it does show that the incidence of infections of syphilis in England and Wales was lower in 1995, with only about 132 diagnosed cases. And as we see on the chart, in 2000, there's been an increase to about 326 cases. And if you look specifically at the chart, there's a noticeable rise in syphilis among men who have sex with men compared to heterosexual partners, and then female rise in syphilis. And this next slide is a graph that shows primary and secondary syphilis and the distribution of cases by sex and sexual behavior. And as you can see on here, of those who have syphilis, about 52% of that constitute the men who have sex with men only, and then the other half is among different populations. So this next slide on here, so in addition to sexual trends in sexual behavior that are changing, another proposed reason as to why there's a rise in incidence of STIs and syphilis can be because there's more testing. So if there's more testing available, then more cases will be diagnosed. However, this is not the only reason, as there's actually a real rise in the actual case as well. So while the increased testing can explain part of the rise, it's not the entire story. Sexual health clinic attendances did increase about 10% between 2013 and 2016, and by about 30% of those men who have sex with men. So changing behavior is also driving the increased attendance. Increase in infections, however, actually outstrips the increase in testing. Part of the problem with the increased incidence is that there are actual large budget cuts to sexual health services. And so according to Laycock, who is the head of policy at HIV charity, the Terrace Higgins Trust. She's on the next slide. She does say that there's continual deep cuts to sexual health services across England, and they're definitely playing a huge role in the rise of STIs. The number of people accessing these sexual services continue to rise, and so when you have an increased demand for the sexual health services, but not an increase of supply, we're gonna basically perpetuate the problem of increasing syphilis incidence. So on this next slide here, it's basically a concept map of everything we just talked about. So the things that contribute to the rise in syphilis, we talked about the increase in men having sex with men causing an increased incidence in STIs being diagnosed, but also improved technology and the presence of chemsex. And the big problem here we see on this, the left side is the budget cuts to sexual health services. It kind of makes a cycle there. With the increased rise in syphilis, there's an increased demand, but the demand for it does not meet the supply, and hence we have people who have latent infections perpetuating the transmission of syphilis. So this next slide is basically just a summary of everything we talked about. Key points here, just social factors and financial factors influence people's behavior, and with regards to the chemsex trend, men having sex with men, and the budget cuts, and specifically how chemsex increases risky behavior, oral sex contraction. So syphilis is spread via bodily fluids, and so oral sex can aid in the transmission of syphilis, and as well as the decreased availability of testing and treatment due to the budget cuts. These are all things that are contributing. So the next part, I will turn this over to Sun.
Yes, I'm going to talk about the socio-ecological model. In this model, there are 5 categories: intrapersonal, interpersonal, organizational, and community and societal. In the category of intrapersonal, those following issues will be belonging to this category: lack of knowledge about increased infection, syphilis, and individuals seeking health and screening behavior, and more riskier behavior will be this category. And lack of support of friends or family will be interpersonal level. And education at work, education in school, education in healthcare clinic will be organizational category, and screening tests, and treatment accessibility and availability will be organizational. In community, trans-sex trend is one of the young generation trend, so it will be under the category of community. And budget cut, it is one of the policy of healthcare, so it will be a societal category. I'm going to look for theories of health behaviors, especially for individuals who are not looking for healthcare or STI services. So there are 2 models: health belief models and theory of vision action. First one here, health belief model. There are 6 factors in here. The first thing is perceived benefits, perceive the barriers, perceive the seriousness, perceive the susceptibility, and self-efficacy, and cues to action. So perceive the susceptibility, they would think, oh, it will not happen to me, or syphilis has been eradicated in the UK, so they don't look for any screening test or help. And perceive the severity will be so very low, so I am not at risk. I won't get on STI. It is a perceived severity, and therefore the benefit perceived is none. So barriers to go to the sexual health clinic will be stigma. They will think, oh, I will be stigmatized by other people, by themselves, and also they make their stigmatization make them to go for help. And also the budget cut will make the less accessibility to sexual health services. Self-efficacy, even though the oral sex still gives the infection to those who enjoying the oral sex, but they think I'll use condom in risky situations, so I'm safe. And also I can't get the treatment whenever I have the disease. So their self-efficacy will be very high, but even though the risk is really high. Cures to action will be the condom availability and screening test availability, education availability. If people are exposed to those availability of condoms, screening, and education, they're aware more, and they will get treatment or help from the services. And if they know someone who has the disease, they will be more scared, so they were gonna go to clinic to check it. So the second theory is a theory of a vision action. There are 6 factors in this theory also: behavioral belief and evaluation of outcome, normative belief and motivation to comply. Behavioral belief and evaluation of the visual tool will make the attitude, and normative belief and motivation to comply will make the subject norm. So behavioral belief, they all said, oh, I don't have any risky things, and therefore I don't have any, therefore they don't have any other symptom and any risk factors, so they will not get the infection. So attitude will be, so I don't need to get a test done. I don't need to get a screening done. So normative belief, condom usage could be embarrassing, especially for guys. And condom usage changes the pleasure of sex. They think condom usage will decrease the pleasure. Motivation to comply. Syphilis has been eradicated in the UK, and there is a good treatment available, so they can have the treatment whenever they have real disease. So motivation will be very low. Subject, that makes the subject norm. So syphilis is not a threat for them. So here's a letter to editor. So I'm gonna just read through. Given the current technology of dating apps such as Grindr and the trend toward sexual promiscuity, I believe it is crucial for the government to increase funding for primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention against STIs. The government must invest in educating the public about syphilis and other STIs, as well as promote safe sex via condom use. Syphilis can remain latent for over a year and can result in significant morbidity. Concomitant infection of syphilis with HIV not only increases the viral load on HIV patient by activating the immune system, but syphilitic ulcers also facilitate the spread of HIV. To halt the spread of syphilis and other STIs, sexual health services such as screening tests must be made available for at-risk individuals. These interventions may be helpful to address the rise in syphilis. So summary. So syphilis on the rise from 2,800 to 71 cases in the last decade. And there is a behavioral change which impact the syphilis on the rise. So there will be increase in men who have sex with men population, like a bisexual population, homosexual population. They are more likely to contract syphilis, and they're more like a screen test done, and they're like more likely to have more diagnosis of syphilis. So chemsex trend will make the less inhibition and less protection for those people, and dating apps make them more casual relationship with other people. Budget could also make it, accessibility, sexual health service accessibility. So they visit the service less. So there was more chance that disease spread widely. So we just look at theories of health behavior, which is the health belief model, and theory of regional action. This is the references we just talked about. Thank you.